Imagine this for a moment. A democracy that still has its elections, still has its courts, its constitution is still there, but it's just not meaningfully free anymore. That creeping, quiet erosion, not some dramatic military coup, that's the central fear in the book, How Democracies Die.
It's the modern danger they're pointing to, and it's more than just a fear, isn't it? It's a pattern. The authors, Levitsky and Ziblatt, they make this really compelling case that today's autocrats are often insiders.
Elected insiders.
Elected insiders who use the system's own rules to, well, to break it from within.
And that's why we're doing this. We believe that some books must be challenged, that a real critique is necessary. For this discussion, we're using a step-by-step critical thinking framework. We're mapping claims to evidence.
Right, drawing on the work of people like Richard Paul and Linda Elder.
We're also applying an intellectual framework from Mortimer J. Adler's work, and we'll use concepts like the Golden Rule and the U.S. Preamble to look for ethical asymmetries. And we'll wrap up with a logical analysis and a balanced conclusion.
And just so you know, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM. The whole goal here is a deeper, more dynamic book critique.
We're not here to praise the book or to condemn it.
No, we're here to reason through it, to really unpack its assumptions and its conclusions.
Okay, so let's start with the core thesis. It's actually quite simple. Constitutional rules are not enough. The whole system has survived because of these, what do they call them? Fragile guardrails?
Unwritten rules, basically. And they identify two that are absolutely essential.
Let's unpack those.
The first one is mutual toleration. It's this idea that you have to view your political opposition as a legitimate rival.
Not an enemy.
Not an existential enemy, exactly. You have to accept that they have a right to exist, a right to hold power, even if you passionately disagree with everything they stand for.
That seems so fundamental. I mean, if you see the other side as illegitimate, the whole basis for elections just, it falls apart.
It does. And the second norm, institutional forbearance, is maybe a little more subtle, but just as critical.
Which means?
It means doing less than what the law allows. It's about self-restraint. It's choosing not to weaponize every single procedural tool you have just to win a short-term political battle.
Can you give us a solid example of that? Because right now it feels like every tool is on the table all the time.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the Supreme Court. For 150 years after 1869, its size stayed at 9 justices. It wasn't because there was a law preventing a party in power from adding more seats. They could have.
They had the votes at different times.
Many times. But they showed forbearance. The unwritten rule was, we won't pack the court for our benefit today because we know it would destroy the institution's legitimacy and that would hurt us tomorrow when we're out of power.
So these two norms, toleration and forbearance, they're the foundation of the book's entire diagnosis.
Right. The argument is that these norms are not permanent, they're historically contingent, and that they're now eroding at an alarming rate in the United States.
And that erosion leads us to their diagnostic kit for spotting potential authoritarians.
Yes. They lay out 4 clear warning signs. First, a rejection of democratic rules of the game. Second, denying the legitimacy of your opponents.
Number 3.
Tolerating or even encouraging violence. And fourth, a willingness to curb civil liberties, especially for the press or your critics. The authors argue that, lately, you don't have to look very hard to see these boxes being checked in American politics.
And they connect this with their gatekeeping theory. It's this idea that political party leaders, the establishment, have this special responsibility to act as gatekeepers.
To block the would-be authoritarians, to keep them out of the mainstream, even if it costs them an election in the short term. The burden is on them to protect the system.
If the gatekeepers fail, the whole thing is exposed. The Constitution is just paper without the behavior to back it up.
Precisely.
Let's pivot now to the book's strengths, because it does have some major ones. I think the broad evidentiary base is incredibly compelling. It's not just about the U.S.
That's maybe its biggest strength, the comparative politics research. It pulls us out of this idea of American exceptionalism. They draw these powerful parallels to Peru under Fujimori, or Viktor Orban in Hungary.
Where they used legal means to dismantle democracy.
Exactly. They used their constitutional power to pack courts, to rewrite media laws. It shows that democratic decay is often a procedural, almost boring process. It's not tanks in the streets.
And that corrects that old naive belief. It replaces that image with this slow, legalistic decay. The death by 1,000 cuts through things like obstruction, media harassment, selective prosecutions.
And another huge contribution is just the conceptual clarity, giving people terms like mutual toleration and institutional forbearance. It gives you a vocabulary for that feeling that politics has just become cruel, that's
Right.
become a zero-sum game.
It puts a name to the feeling of things falling apart.
Yes, it does.
The book also shifts the burden of responsibility. It's not about finding one leader to save us. It calls for these broad coalitions across party lines, all committed to just defending the rules of the game.
It's an ethic of shared civic agency. It frames democracy as this cooperative project that we all have to consciously maintain. It's not a machine that just runs on its own.
That cooperative idea flows right into the ethical framework of the book. I mean, mutual toleration.
Mhm.
There's just the golden rule, isn't it?
It absolutely is. Treat your political opponents with the rights and respect you'd want if they were in power. It's pure reciprocity.
And you can run what we call the U.S. preamble test. When they describe extreme partisanship, questioning election results, they're measuring that behavior against the preamble's goals of justice, domestic tranquility, the general welfare.
And arguing that recent behavior fails that test spectacularly.
This brings us to a really controversial part of the book, what we call the ethical asymmetry. They place much, much heavier blame on the long-term radicalization of the Republican Party.
They do. They cite its increasing willingness to question elections and undermine voting rights, tracing it back to the 1990s and arguing it accelerated dramatically.
And while that claim is based on documented events, it raises a huge question.
Does it risk deepening the very polarization it's trying to diagnose? By framing one side as the primary norm breaker, you could alienate the very people you need to build that pro-democracy coalition.
That's a vital question to ask, and it leads us to a moment of self-reflection. Before we go any further, we want you to try a mindful moment. Just set the book aside for a second and ask yourself, where am I personally tempted to break norms because I distrust the other side?
It turns the book into a kind of mirror. How does our own language, maybe on social media, our demand for total victory, feed into the exact dynamics the authors are warning us about?
And here's mindful moment number 2. Think about your own favorite leaders. Do they practice institutional forbearance when they're in power? Or do they only demand it from the opposition? If a tactic feels illegitimate in your opponent's hands, then it's a micro breach of democratic ethics when your side uses it. We pack these ideas into all our deep dives on our YouTube channel.
We offer AI book analysis, summaries, critiques, and these podcasts. The goal is always to inspire reflection and rational thought.
Okay, let's get back to the critique and turn to the book's logical weaknesses. The first big one is what critics call the causality gap.
Right. The book is great at describing how extreme polarization kills norms, but it's less clear on what's causing the polarization itself. It's treated almost as a force of nature.
It doesn't fully integrate the structural drivers, things like massive economic inequality, the complete fracturing of the media, or the long, deep history of racial hierarchy. How do those things create the polarization that makes breaking norms a winning strategy?
You get a very strong sense that norms matter, but a much weaker sense of how you could possibly rebuild them when all those hostile conditions are still in place.
The second major critique really goes after the elite gatekeeping thesis. The authors kind of hold up the mid-20th century as a time when gatekeepers did their job.
But critics argue that this romanticizes that era. It's a really important historical and ethical point. That stability, that norm equilibrium of the 50s and 60s, it was built on a foundation of racial exclusion.
The gatekeepers preserved a democracy for some.
A stable but limited democracy for white citizens, while black citizens were systematically disenfranchised. That stability came at an ugly, ugly cost, and the book doesn't quite wrestle with the implications of defending that kind of exclusionary equilibrium.
So when they call for a return to old norms, they risk, even unintentionally, calling for a return of the political culture that enabled that exclusion.
Exactly. And you also see strong critiques from both the left and the right.
From the political left, the argument is that focusing so much on civility and norms can actually mask deeper power imbalances.
Their focus is on gerrymandering, voter suppression, economic inequality. For them, you can't fix those huge structural problems with a call for more politeness. They worry that norms talk just ends up protecting an unjust status quo.
Then from the right,
the critique is that the book applies its authoritarian checklist selectively, that it downplays or ignores norm violations by progressive actors, whether it's on-campus speech or criticizing the courts or using executive power. They argue the diagnosis is applied unevenly.
Finally, there's a more measured take from comparative scholars. They acknowledge the risks are real, But they also point out that the U.S. still has a remarkably strong civil society, a pluralistic media, and competitive elections.
The foundations are still there, even if the stress fractures are obvious. Their view is that the book's tone can sometimes blur the line between a serious risk and imminent collapse.
So after all that, how does the book hold up? If we measure it against, say, Mortimer J. Adler's standards for a great book, what's the verdict?
Well, as a diagnostic essay, it's brilliant. It states the problem clearly, it defines its terms perfectly, and it presents a coherent, evidence-based argument. It succeeds on that level. Its weakness is as a prescriptive blueprint.
It tells you what's wrong, but not exactly how to fix it.
Right. The call for broad coalitions is more of a high-level exhortation, an ethical plea, rather than a systematic plan that connects specific actions to specific structural causes.
So the balanced verdict seems to be this. How Democracies Die is a serious, vital, good-faith defense of democratic life. It's grounded in respect and self-restraint. And maybe its greatest value isn't as a prophecy of doom.
No, it's as an invitation.
An invitation to scrutinize our own choices. How every decision made by citizens, by parties, by leaders, either reinforces or chips away at those unwritten guardrails of a free society.
And we should add that this critique has been guided by a structured set of critical thinking tools. We're mapping arguments to evidence, evaluating logical coherence, and using ethical reasoning based on reciprocity and democratic ideals. These frameworks guided our whole approach to the book's logic and its recommendations.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via our link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.